Hi friends, it's Heike. Today our special guest and expert is here to talk about something we all want to know more about. And that is cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol that makes it almost impossible to lose weight or lose the body fat, and strategies of how to overcome emotional eating that is related to cortisol levels, and the mind shifts that we need to make or can make to help us lose the weight, lose the body fat, and not gain it all back. So today, we are talking about the truth behind cortisol and weight gain for over 50s. Before we dive in, if you're not sure where to start a healthy lifestyle, nutrition, a little bit of exercise, grab my 5 for 50 Kickstarter for women over 50 so you get a little bit of a head start and listen to today's episode. I'll see you soon. I'm Heike Yates, a fitness and nutrition coach with 30 years of experience. I empower women over 50 to take back their health and strength to lead a vibrant life. Right now, you're joined by thousands of women over 50 around the world who stop dimming their light and instead ignite their spark. On this podcast, I do what I do best, taking complicated information about fitness, nutrition, and mindset strategies and breaking it down into baby steps that are simple, actionable, and sustainable so you can implement them into your life. I regularly interview some of the most inspiring women who share their honest stories on how they went from their worst to their best life, so that you know you're not alone in your struggles. Join me as we redefine what aging looks and feels like by taking action and saying, yes, I can. This is the Pursue Your Spark podcast. Hi, everybody. Today's guest is Cassie Christopher, a registered dietitian and mom to a busy toddler. She supports postmenopausal women to get a handle on emotional eating so they can feel more confident in their bodies without depriving themselves of what makes them happy in life. Welcome to the show today, Cassie.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here talking to you again, Heike.
Oh, it's awesome. You had me on your Facebook group and we talked about why we tinkle and why we sometimes pee and laugh and cough and sneeze and have all these problems. And I'm so excited to have you back after your first visit with my audience about emotional eating. We're talking today about the big C word, cortisol. The big C word, cortisol and weight gain for over 50s, because I don't know how many times I hear cortisol here, cortisol there, this and that and the other. And we really don't know what it is. And so I have a ton of questions for you around that topic as you're the expert in that niche. But before we dive into the big C, is I want to know, and I know my listeners want to know, is what inspires you to do what you do?
Yeah. Oh, what a fun question. What inspires me? Gosh, I have to say, I had the benefit of talking to a couple of clients last week and doing little testimonial videos and hearing the story of women who have this lifetime of dieting. Maybe a lot of women I work with were put on diets as early as like third grade. I mean, we're talking young. And then now into their 50s, into their 60s, they're still battling and on that diet train. And I was listening to a woman speak about how she now has a relationship with food and her body, where she is no longer binge eating. She feels amazing. And she doesn't look at herself as bad. She loves herself. She doesn't look as food as bad. There's no the good and the bad. I guess what inspires me, what I'm trying to say about this, is how someone's relationship with food and the way that they eat and the way that they think about food is often so intricately tied to the way they think about themselves. And so my clients come to me and they say, I love myself. And I'm like, whoa, that's huge. And that's inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah. It's nice to hear that that we can make that change in somebody's life,
Yeah.
and they recognizing that they actually made a change. That is
Mhm.
definitely inspiring, but also empowering for us as coaches.
Yeah, I think just recognizing how intricately, I mean, we know this at like a head level that like everything's connected, but to really see that play out, that's what I'm inspired by this week. Yeah, so thanks for asking that question.
Yes. So the big C, how is cortisol produced and how is it released in the body? Because
Mhm.
we hear this word all the time and it has all these blame things. But let's start from where does it come from and how is it released in the body?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's helpful to understand that cortisol is the primary stress hormone in the body. There are other hormones as well, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. There are other hormones, but cortisol is that primary fight, flight, or freeze hormone. And so if you get in, say, a fender bender, okay, I don't want to talk about something more serious. Let's just say you get in a fender bender and your heart starts to beat, maybe your face turns red, you kind of get that nervous anxiety in your body, maybe you shake a little bit. That is this fight, flight, or freeze reflex. You might do any of those as a result of feeling like that. Um, and if you think back to our ancestors, I always tell a story like, say you are living on the plains and there is a saber-toothed tiger running after you. That's going to raise cortisol, which is the major stress hormone in your body. And you are so glad that in that moment, blood is diverted, the resources of your body are diverted away from things like resting and digesting towards that fight, flight, or freeze. Like you need that blood pumping so you can run as fast as you can, or you can hide behind a bush or whatever, right? The problem that happens in the modern world is that our bodies are responding to the world around us as if we're being chased by saber-toothed tigers, but we're not. We're just in a fender bender, or our boss ticked us off, or God forbid our husbands, or right, or our barista spelled our name embarrassingly wrong, or whatever, right? Like just little things that aren't that big of a deal can still inflate this same fight, flight, or freeze response. And so when that happens, what's happening is the adrenal gland in your brain is producing the stress hormone cortisol and sending it out to the rest of your body to say, hey, something's going on here. And what happens as a result, beyond those symptoms I mentioned, the red face, the fight, flight, or freeze kind of responses, is your body it tries to conserve. Really, what your body is doing in terms of energy balance is it's trying to make quick energy.
Mhm.
And many of us would prefer that our bodies would be burning fat, right? And what cortisol does is it actually causes the body to create blood sugar for energy rather than using fat. So then the consequences of that is that your body then shifts into fat storage mode because the hormone insulin is triggered. This can cause insulin sensitivity as well. So if you have excess cortisol over time, you end up with you can end up with conditions like diabetes or pre-diabetes. um, and and then cortisol moves fat from other parts of the body to the belly, so you get more belly fat, weight gain. And then I also see cortisol lead to some rather pretty extreme cravings, which we can talk about more in detail. But just understanding how cortisol comes into play when we're talking about weight. And then there's that psychological factor as well, where when you feel nervous and anxious and stressed, mean, yes, you get the food cravings and you do the stress eating, but even more like it's hard to care for yourself well because you're kind of in that survival rather than thrive mode. Um, yeah, is that making sense? I can tell you about what raises cortisol as well if that's helpful.
Oh, we get to that too, but is there ever too much or too little cortisol?
Yeah, both.
Right.
Both. So th- the idea being some of your audience may have heard words like adrenal fatigue.
Right.
And the idea is when you get these signals that you need the cortisol and you're stressed over and over and over again, initially you'll have an elevated, a higher cortisol. And then what can happen is if it happens for a long time and it's a chronic problem, then the adrenals just get fatigued and you might have a low cortisol levels. Um, and essentially, the things that you do are more or less similar in both situations. It's all about really nourishing and caring for your adrenal glands, whether they're high or low. Um, but I also want to clarify I'm talking about subtle shifts, things that may not come up if you have your doctor test your blood for cortisol. Um,
Which
if
was one of my other questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it's important to know because there are legitimate, I mean, I don't want to say legitimate diseases like what we're talking about isn't legitimate, but there are, diagnoses like Addison's disease where your cortisol is just very imbalanced.
Mhm.
And that's if you have that, like you're going to know because it'll be a big problem in your life. Your medical team will be working on it. So what I'm talking about here are more these kind of subtle shifts that we can have in our lives.
Yeah, because I hear this in conjunction with cortisol is that, like you said, the Addison's disease, which is not what we're talking about because we're talking
Right.
about weight gain, but also the adrenal fatigue that's the medical community right now has fallen in love with because that's like, so I don't know how many women have told me that they have adrenal fatigue
Right.
and they need to do all these things. And I'm like, that's not my expertise, but I'm just wondering why that is. Or is this just because the cortisol levels are out of whack? And like you said, you said it nicely. It's like they're just anxious all the time.
Mhm. And there's a lot of other things that can tax your adrenals or raise cortisol. One that is very prevalent for this audience is menopause.
Mhm.
Research shows that the menopausal transition can raise cortisol levels. So it's interesting that you're seeing a lot of that with the women you work with, who I think mostly are postmenopausal women. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So they've been through that change, had the cortisol levels raise as a result, and now are maybe dealing with the after effects.
Mhm. Yep.
Other things that can raise cortisol is inflammation in the body. So, one of cortisol's roles in the body is to lower inflammation. If anyone has ever taken, medications to lower inflammation, oftentimes it's steroids, it's cortisol, so they know kind of what that effect feels like. So conditions like arthritis, any autoimmune issues, blood sugar imbalance is another thing that can raise cortisol. So diabetes or prediabetes, all of those things can result in elevated cortisol. A big one is poor sleep, which is interesting because that often happens in the time of menopause as well. Separately from cortisol, but cortisol actually controls your circadian rhythm. It controls your sleep wake cycle. And so if you are not sleeping well, that's going to cause an imbalance in cortisol. And if cortisol is imbalanced, it can mess up your sleep. So it's like a chicken or the egg.
Um,
In terms of weight gain, which I know we're talking about here, there's really good research. A 2015 meta analysis showed that for every hour of sleep that you're deprived, you eat an additional, how many calories would you guess, Heike? Maybe you know.
okay, I'm gonna go for 200.
380 calories for every hour of
Really?
sleep you're deprived.
Well, because I was thinking an apple, it's like 150 calories. So I was thinking,
Mhm.
okay, so you can eat several apples, or which probably most of the women are choosing is a bar of chocolate or some other sweets. Or I know we always talk about donuts, and many people are like, I'm not eating donuts, but you maybe eat a Danish, or you gotta grab a bagel, with 12 bazillion calories.
or like a frappuccino, right? So we're thinking like
Good.
caffeinated drinks because you're tired that have more sugar in them. That's good. You're going to be more likely to do something like that when you're sleep deprived than if you aren't and you're just having a latte, and that's okay with you.
Yeah. So how do you measure cortisol? Because I never knew that.
Yeah, so cortisol can be measured via the blood, via the urine, or via saliva.
Ah,
And, as I said, if you go to your doctor more often and you say, "Hey, I want a cortisol test," they'll probably say, "You really don't need one. You don't have any, signs of like Addison's disease. So you don't need one." And really, I think it's because our current testing methods just aren't that great. The body controls the amount of cortisol in your blood to such a finite, degree that if it was out of balance, it would mean something serious, like you have like an adrenal tumor or something, right? Like it would be like a big problem. Urine and saliva methods are a little bit more sensitive. And so for saliva, for instance, they often do that if you're having trouble sleeping and you spit into a tube a couple times a day and even once in the middle of the night, and it looks at your cortisol levels throughout the day. That can be a little more sensitive. And then the urine is a bit more sensitive as well, looking at metabolites to see are you low or high or normal in cortisol. But even if you're normal in all of those areas, if you're stressed out a lot, and I didn't even talk about psychological stress because I guess I thought it was obvious raises cortisol, right? If you're stressed out a lot, if you're struggling with weight gain, if you have more fat to your belly, if you're having really intense food cravings, you can bet cortisol is likely an issue for you, even if the tests don't necessarily show it.
yeah, because I find, when you talk about the medical community, that when somebody, and I haven't tested this, but I know from other cases that when we come in and we say, we have all these issues, and they're like, no, you don't. You're fine. Just go home and run around the block once, or they don't take us serious when these are serious issues, not only for weight gain but emotional well-being, and we're just being shoved to the side by the medical community. Or the next thing is, here's another drug for you to take and go home. And
Mhm.
that's why I'm so glad we're talking about this, because I don't believe in taking a lot of drugs, taking a lot of medications unless absolutely necessary. And so, how if we feel that way and we have gone to the doctor and they say you're fine, but you're not fine, and you've gained like all this fat around your belly, and you're not sleeping well, because I know about myself. I mean, I'm 60 now, and I have a lot of nights where I just don't sleep well.
Mhm.
And as a fitness professional, I know what to do, and I'm doing all the things. And sometimes I just say, what, it is what it is. And maybe there's an underlying thing that bothers me. But overall, I want the women to listen, to say, okay, now, Cassie, tell us. We have all these things you guys are talking about. I want to lose weight. What do I eat? Where do I start now? Because I don't want to be overwhelmed with a big exercise program and another diet and all these things. So where do we start?
Yeah, yeah. So for hormone balance, I recommend like a two-pronged approach. The first being nutrition, and we can talk about what specifically that looks like to help balance cortisol and how to not make it feel like another diet, right? Because that's important. Um, and then the other piece being stress reducing lifestyle strategies.
Mhm.
And so if someone says, "Hey, I don't want to go, do couch to 5K or like join whatever, the gym, I'd want to work on cortisol in a different way." Those are two really pretty relatively easy places to start
Is with,
with. Yeah. So with the nutrition, the cortisol balancing nutrition, which I can
I
go
was like, I was waiting for like, okay, now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Is there a
I was so,
drum roll in there?
I was so like, oh yeah, okay, here she comes. There it is. Stop the donut. No, I'm just kidding.
I love it. So, well, let me break it down for you
Break
from
it
the
down. Yeah,
nutrition perspective.
Yep.
So, what I recommend for nutrition is now that you understand what raises cortisol, that's actually the key to understanding how to help cortisol balance. So, we talked about inflammation being a primary driver of cortisol, and then we talked about blood sugar imbalances. So, targeting those two things with nutrition is the best way to get a handle on cortisol. So, what I mean by that, anti inflammatory choices are going to be the things you traditionally think of as healthy, the fruits, the vegetables, the healthy fats, the omega 3s, all of these things are anti inflammatory, and can make a big difference in, yeah, even how you feel, especially if you're suffering from some inflammatory issues. The other nutritional recommendation is that blood sugar balance. And this is the one that I find to be so crucial, especially if people are doing a lot of nighttime eating or if they're struggling with overeating in general. This blood sugar balance can play a big role, because what happens is if you get a blood sugar spike from, say, some refined carbohydrates or some sugar and then a resulting low, then the body kicks in and gets more cortisol going. So the answer is to eat a balanced, macronutrient ratio where you really focus on protein and fiber, because those things help to balance blood sugar. When I say fiber, I'm talking about things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, so protein and fiber, regularly throughout the day. So I know, fasting is popular, and there is even ways to incorporate this here. But what I've found with women who are struggling with overeating, especially at night, is getting a solid breakfast in with these components can actually go a long way towards balancing their blood sugar throughout the day, and just eating regularly. Oftentimes, when people are famished at the end of the day, they do a lot of their eating after dinner. It's because they just haven't really eaten much at all during the day. So they've got all these hunger hormones on top of the cortisol that are causing the eating.
Very true. When I teach intermittent fasting, since we're talking about fasting,
Yeah,
I
please.
have all these examples how women can fast. There's not just the 16-8, which is like the magic number in many women's minds.
Yeah.
And it all depends on what your goal is with intermittent fasting. Is like you said, if you want to lower your sugar cravings, or if you want to balance out your hormones, you got to look at fasting a little bit differently than just saying, oh, I'm going to do the 16-8, I'm going to the 4-2, whatever is out there. And I talk about this with my group of women about this. And I'm like, you have to choose which one works for you, because not all fasting is for everybody.
That's a
And
really great point. And there's research too to show that, skipping a lot of meals raises cortisol. And so if that's your issue, those long periods, like you're saying, may not be a good fit. And, it's great that there are professionals like you helping people, I guess, giving people permission to listen to their bodies. Like, hey, this can still work for you,
Mhm.
but like, figure out, does it feel good? How are you feeling with this? That's a
Yeah,
great
and I was just recently interviewed for a summit where we talked about intermittent fasting, and the interviewer says, I really want to know. And she said, I get, what is it called? Hangry?
hangry.
Angry. She said, I get really hangry when I don't eat for 14 hours. And I'm like, well, then do eat earlier.
Yeah.
Give yourself permission. Don't get hangry. Just, eat when your body says, oh, yeah, it's time. Because there is the fine line, and it ties in with you. What you're coaching is that the hormones just, the insulin levels drop or raise depending on where we are.
Yeah.
And when you get to that feeling in fasting where you're just drained, that's not a good place to be. So if you want to intermittent fast and lower your cortisol level and lose belly fat, you got to listen to the two of us, peeps.
That's right. Combine the modalities here because, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really great point.
So go ahead. So you don't want to go too long without having a complete meal.
Yeah. So that's really so the anti-inflammatory and the blood sugar balancing are the two keys for nutrition. Now, something that you mentioned that stuck out to me earlier when you said people don't want to feel like they're on a diet. And I am all for that. So when I work with people, I do not provide lists of what not to eat or things that they can't have. Rather, we talk about the abundance of things that they love, that they can have, and ways to work food in. I mean, we're talking about eating more. And oftentimes, you might say, well, eating more and weight loss, how are these two things connected? But they are so connected because this history of dieting, yo-yo dieting throughout life actually decreases the metabolism. And I'm sure you see this too. I get women coming to me and they're like, if I eat anything more than 1,200 calories, I immediately gain 5 pounds. And it's like, yikes, you can hardly meet your vitamin and mineral needs at 1,200 calories. That is just not enough food.
Yep.
And so, if your metabolism is so depressed to the point where you can't even meet your nutrient goals, that is a big problem. And the answer is not to then go and do an 800 or 900 or 1,000 calorie diet.
Yep. Mm.
The answer is actually this formula I'm sharing with you where you're eating regularly throughout the day with a focus on protein and fiber. What that does is protein and fiber take more work for your body to digest and break down and utilize. They're so nourishing, to your bones and your cells and your skin and all of this. And so what happens is your metabolism ends up getting a boost from this way of eating. And so I work with women who either they just start to lose weight like easier. I'm not talking about a lot of weight. I'm talking about maybe 1/2 to 2 pounds a week. None of this, 10 pounds in a week mumbo jumbo.
Wow.
But it feels easy because they're not counting or tracking or whatever. Or I also consider it a win. And I had a conversation with someone recently. I said, look, I will consider it a win in my work with you if you get to the end of my 14-week program and you're eating more food and not gaining weight.
Mhm.
Because a lifetime of that yo-yo dieting, it can take a while to get that metabolism up and running. It's possible. I'm not saying it's not. It's just, as I was telling her, in the scope of a 14-week program, we may just get you to the point where your metabolism is like good enough to eat 1,600 calories or more than you were before.
Oh, yeah. What was her response?
At that, she was in it. This is a woman who had been on and off Optavia for probably about 10 years, and she was ready to do something that really nourished her body, and freed her from overeating.
Nice.
Because that's one thing that happens with cortisol when it's high, and research shows, and I love, when I imagine them to be men in lab coats, but maybe women were involved in this research, that when cortisol is high, people tend to eat more. Oh, stress eating, that's a thing. I didn't realize. Um, and so people get these pretty intense cravings with cortisol. Either it feels, I call it a style one, because I don't have a better gimmicky name for it, but craving style one, where you feel like you're addicted to food, you feel compulsively like you have to eat, or impulsive, you can't say no. Or craving style two, where you're just preoccupied with food. You can't stop thinking about it. It's on your mind all day. Like you're kind of always exercising willpower to not go to the vending machine or the cupboard.
Mhm.
Um, and so this blood sugar balance that I'm talking about really does a lot to decrease those cravings. I had a client named Anna. She was like one of these eloquent people. Like everything that came out of her mouth, you could make a bumper sticker out of it. And she said to me, after about 1.5 weeks of working on this nutrition plan, that she finally had the freedom to make healthy choices because that blood sugar was balanced, her cortisol was balanced, and she was feeling good.
Mhm.
And so the hormones, you can't fight those with willpower. So for anyone out there who's just feeling out of control or feeling like they don't have enough willpower or self-control or self-discipline, if they're wondering what's wrong with me, what personality defect do I have, what character defect do I have, and you're resonating with what we're talking about here, I just want to say it's not your fault. It's not your fault. These hormones are so powerful. And, no amount of measly willpower, I mean, right back to the saber-toothed tiger, is going to stop you from running from a saber-toothed tiger. There's a pretty strong self-preservation instinct there.
So what I hear then in that same context is, Cassie, is that then women are going for the sugar buster diet.
Mhm.
I'm not going to have any sugar at all. And I think that's also maybe I'm wrong. It's a wrong approach to go all or nothing. Because when you're so conditioned to eating something that raises your cortisol level and affects your adrenals and your insulin and all this stuff, and then just going like gung ho, no, I'm so proud of myself. I haven't had a piece of sugar in any form, not even a carrot. What are your thoughts on that?
So I would first like to point out that what you just described to me is really actually a disordered way of eating. So I think that's important to recognize that belief that you can't have any sugar or something bad will happen, and now you're starting to cut out even healthy foods, and you have anxiety or fear around eating these foods, that's consistent with, you would have to go see some people to get help, but some disordered eating patterns.
Mhm.
And that's really common in the weight loss space. And in fact, this is my perspective as a registered dietitian who's been in this industry for a while. So let me give that little grain of salt. A lot of people who do weight loss have eating disorders themselves. And so you have to be really careful who you are learning from.
Mhm.
And I love that you said all or nothing thinking. That's a really big sign of having an unhealthy relationship with food. And I don't say that with shame or judgment. I think that's what happens when you've been on and off diets your entire life. You can't trust food, it feels unsafe. But I just want to point that out and say, like, yeah, there's a better way. Like, there is some good healing to be had.
Mhm.
And so this idea that you should cut out all sugar, it's logical, but it's not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen this in other menus in my practice with different things where it's the all or nothing uh, approach, or the I cut a lot of stuff out, and it's been fueled for so long
Yep.
by the fitness and nutrition industry that it's really hard to fight against this. Or you're seeing, the before and after pictures, which I mean, here's my bikini picture before, and you don't look good, it already, and then you lose all this weight because you did drastic things only to go good for a while, and then you repeat the program again because you couldn't maintain what it is that you were trying to achieve. And
Yeah.
it is we're here to educate all of you out there who see the video that we're recording and the audio, spread this news that it's not a healthy way to go. And so, going back to our cortisol, we know now fiber, balanced meals, eat in frequent intervals. Go, Cassie.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, we should have another session where we talk about all or nothing thinking because I could go on and on. But yeah, so that's the nutritional component, the anti inflammatory and blood sugar balancing pieces that you just succinctly summarize. And then the second piece is stress management lifestyle practices. And so this can be different for people depending on what they need. But in general, um, I recommend some mindset work around self compassion on the one hand,
Yes.
which may seem unusual. I could talk about that in a second. And then really kind of down regulating the nervous system and getting that stress management going. And so for many people, this can look different. I use specific breathing practices with my clients. Some people might do yoga, some people might do meditation, some people might have a journal or a prayer, life, like whatever works for you to down regulate. But the importance is, and I talk to people sometimes and they say, "Oh, I meditate every once in a while." And I just want to say, like, meditation may not be for you. Like, that's kind of the cool thing right now. Like, if you're someone who can't do it regularly because like it's just really uncomfortable and you're not a big fan of it, just choose something else. Like, find something that you really like doing that you can do regularly. Now, I use breathing practices with my clients. Very, very simple, just regular breathing. Pay attention to your inhale, pay attention to your exhale for, some amount of time every day. And this is based on research that shows it lowers your cortisol. The other interesting thing your audience might like to know about breathing practices is there is quite a bit of research that shows if you do breathing practices 2 times a day for 15 minutes each session over the course of, I think, 8 weeks or so, 8 to 12 weeks, it can actually lower the incidence of hot flashes.
Ah,
So there you go, because the hot flashes are often triggered by the nervous system. And here we get this whole connection then to, cortisol and stress and menopause and hormones. Um, so the self-compassion piece is important in all of this, especially if you're trying to make nutrition changes or you're trying to do something regularly, because self-compassion is actually the antidote to that all or nothing thinking you talked about, which is important to bring up because if you are stuck in all or nothing where you're either meditating every day and like only eating anti-inflammatory whatever, or you're doing nothing, none of it, right? You never make any progress. And that's hard. That's hard on your adrenals. That's hard, that bouncing back and forth. That's hard on your body. And so rather, when you can be self-compassionate and know that you are experiencing something and it's difficult and you're kind to yourself in the midst of that, then you'll see the partial successes, the partial wins, and you'll be able to actually regularly implement some of these things that we're talking about. Because hearing about them and not implementing them is a big waste of your time. So I'll save you the time and say, rather than beat yourself up for not meditating more often, right? Pick something that you enjoy that helps you feel good when you're stressed. Do it as regularly as you can. And when you do it, celebrate that you're doing it rather than just thinking about how you wish you did it more often and beating yourself up for not doing it enough.
oh God. Or like one of the examples I have, we talked about the good and the bad. There's no good foods and bad foods. I used to work with a client who would frequently come in the door. The first thing she would say is, "I've been bad." I was like, "What's that supposed to mean?" I was like, "You're a pretty nice person." She says, "I didn't do any of the exercises you said, and I ate bad food." I was like, "There's no such thing as bad food. There's just food that's maybe not so good for you." But like you said, give yourself some grace. Don't beat yourself up because you're not perfect, or like somebody on Instagram who seems to have it all together and they have this plan and they execute it seemingly, but who knows? Give yourself grace.
I love that. And when you beat yourself up, guess what happens?
Cortisol.
It raises your cortisol, right? So it's completely, against your plan. And the other thing I wanted to say is that word bad, I call that a sabotage word. So there's bad, there's failure, there's even success, right? There's messed up. These are all sabotage words. Blown it, I've blown it. Those are sabotage words. They are a marker of that all or nothing thinking, and they sabotage your progress.
Mhm. Very good. Now, one question in regard to foods, which seems pretty obvious, but we never should assume that everybody knows. What foods increase your cortisol levels?
Yeah. So, in general, so I almost don't want to talk about this because there are no bad foods, right?
Yeah.
So in general, what I'm going to do is share some foods that can cause inflammation and dysregulation to your blood sugar, because we've already talked about how that raises cortisol. And then I'm going to tell you how you can still eat them and do, kind of yourself a favor by not doing so much damage. How does that sound?
I like that a lot.
Okay. So we've already talked about how inflammation and blood sugar imbalance can raise cortisol. And so when we think about foods that are likely to raise cortisol, it's going to be foods that are inflammatory and disruptive to your blood sugar. So inflammatory foods are going to be things that, I mean, exactly as it sounds, causes inflammation or your immune system to upregulate and respond in your body and kind of start attacking things you don't want it to attack. That's what's happening with inflammation. And those are things like red meat, whole fat dairy sometimes, especially if it's not pasture raised, or oils, oftentimes processed foods, cured meats like, yeah, say a deli meat and salami, like things like that. Generally, a lot of more processed or animal based foods tend to be inflammatory. Now, I will tell you that a good way to get those in your nutrition plan are um, to pay attention to how things are grown or sourced. Pasture raised meats and animal products tend to have higher levels of omega-3s than non-pasture raised, because pasture raised means the cow was eating grass, rather than corn, and that grass has the omega-3s. So those have a little bit healthier fat profile. Um, and watching portions, a portion size of meat, just so you know, is about the size of a deck of cards. The size of your palm is another good indicator. And the portion size of cheese is about the size of your thumb or two dice. And so understanding portions can help you enjoy those foods and get them in, but maybe not rely on them for your primary sustenance.
Mhm.
Also, if you pair those foods with half a plate of vegetables, which is what I tell my clients to do, who cares? You're getting so much anti-inflammatory goodness from that half a plate of vegetables that what's on the other half of your plate just becomes a lot less of an issue, right? So we're focusing on abundance.
I love that. Because that doesn't mean I have to cut anything out. I don't have to not eat my Gouda cheese because that's my favorite cheese
I
or
would
brie
never
or
say.
whatever.
Yeah, I would never say.
But you still have it, but not as a main portion on your plate with some crackers. So I think that's such a good suggestion
Yeah.
of how to look at it.
The other thing is the blood sugar balance. So I talked about how the blood sugar spike then results in a low, and that results in cortisol being elevated. So watching out for foods that cause that blood sugar spike. Now, here's the cool thing about this is our bodies. So when stuff ends up in your stomach, it's all mixed together. So your body does not think about what you're eating in terms of the individual items that you eat. Your body processes it all as one big ball of grossness called chyme, actually, CHYME for any nutrition nerds out there. Uh, and so your body isn't thinking about that you had a donut from earlier or chocolate or a cookie or whatever. It's thinking about chyme. And so the answer here is if you're going to have high sugar foods or high refined carbohydrate foods, that'd be like white flour, things that have a high GI glycemic index. People might be familiar with that as a way of dieting that was popular 5 to 10 years ago now.
Yep.
So blast from the past, right back for you, everybody. So those kinds of foods, if you can pair them with the protein and with the fiber that I mentioned earlier, we're coming full circle now. It's going to have I mean, hardly an impact to your blood sugar, much less than if you ate it alone. Um, so that's how, those are the foods that can raise cortisol, right? The sugary, the refined carbs, and you can really mitigate the impact by just eating it with a balanced meal or snack.
That's a great idea. Now, of course, I have to ask because many women love to drink wine, and a lot of people still drink coffee. Nothing wrong with coffee, but what about coffee and alcohol
Mhm.
in relation to cortisol?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the research on both of those tends to be a little more conflicting. And I've gone in and done, deep dives like, what's the consensus? And as far as I can tell with coffee, so in general, coffee is a stimulant, and a stimulant logically would raise cortisol. And so the idea being, um, a lot of coffee may contribute, especially if you're dealing with feelings of anxiety or jitteriness or those kinds of things. Like maybe that caffeine is not the best solution. But it seems to be that if you have like the same amount of caffeine, your body adjusts to it and gets used to it. And so it's unlikely to be a huge bump on your cortisol. Um, Unless you then add a significant amount, on top of what you normally have. So I guess from what I can tell in the research, that consistency with cortisol is really, or with caffeine is really helpful to cortisol levels, if you're going to have caffeine in general.
Mhm.
In terms of wine, now wine or like a drink here or there is not going to have a big effect on cortisol. Now, where it will is if you have you have enough to the point that, so alcohol can lower your blood sugar. And when your blood sugar gets low, everyone knows, you repeat it with me, right? Your cortisol gets elevated.
Ah,
Yeah, we've got a catchphrase on this podcast. Um, and so if you're having a lot of wine, it lowers your blood sugar. That's going to raise your cortisol. The other thing wine can do is interrupt your sleep, which raises cortisol. And so, in general, keeping alcohol to an occasional thing is probably going to be best if you're dealing with cortisol issues. But again, I don't ever want to say you can't have it or cut it out. I think, especially with things like alcohol and caffeine, once you have cut through the unhelpful baggage that you carry from dieting, you can reestablish a relationship with your body to the point where you can determine if wine or coffee is helpful for you personally. But it's hard to do that until you've balanced your hormones, like we've talked about, because I mean, the hormones are just screaming to eat. So those need to be balanced first. And then you can develop that relationship to tell what makes you feel good.
I like that a lot because this again, it's not about deprivation, it's about balance, it's about loving yourself, recognizing what your body needs and not what your brain sometimes tell you from old patterns that you've established through dieting and you as an emotional eating expert, you clearly can see the connection between the cortisol and the emotional eating, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because of those causes, those cravings, you feel out of control because your hormones are screaming at you to eat.
Those hormones, these little devils. Now, now, Cassie, what would be a couple of 2 or 3 tips that you can give my audience that they can start today to say, you know what, you can do this little step, and at least it gets them set off on the right path to dealing with cortisol issues?
Ooh, I love this. I love this question because really there are little tiny things you can do that will make a very big difference. And the first one is going to be to notice every day a win or partial win, maybe a partial success, and take a moment. Take a moment to just go, wow, I did that. Go me. And really like bask in that win, to celebrate. And I talk to my clients sometimes about Oh my gosh, I just got off the phone earlier. Oh my gosh, you've lost 8 pounds in 14 weeks and you're sleeping better and you're moving more and you don't have as many cravings and you're feeling less stressed even while you were tapering off an anxiety med. Oh my gosh, I'm freaking out. Like, how are you going to celebrate? And she's like, oh, well, we're going away for the weekend this weekend. Yeah, but you're not doing that because of your accomplishment. The accomplishment's getting swept under the rug.
Mhm.
So you need to take a moment to notice those accomplishments. That's going to help with the compassion that we talked about. And that's going to help you keep making progress because you're going to see, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. And the next day, I'm doing it until eventually, wow, you're eating salads all the time. Who is this person, right? Um, the second, I'm not saying you have to eat salads all the time. Let me tell you, I cannot eat a salad for dinner. It's just like, it's against my beliefs. It just doesn't feel good to my body. Lunch, fine. Breakfast, even, yeah, okay, but not for dinner. Anyways, the other piece being protein. So oftentimes when I talk to people, especially if they're trying to embrace more of the plants, the anti-inflammatory plants, they just forget about protein. And there's a lot of amazing protein sources. Whatever nutrition plan you follow, just Google, like vegan protein or whole foods plant-based protein or just good protein sources, healthy protein sources, right? Whatever it is you do, focus on protein. That's going to, again, be that protein and fiber component that helps balance your blood sugar, make you feel full, and reduce your cravings. And then, my third tip would be, gosh, how do I choose? My third tip would be to pay attention to how you personally feel, not how you think you should feel or how you want to feel. Because especially Heike mentioned, I do emotional eating. Oftentimes we eat because we would rather not sit and feel how bored we are. We would rather not feel how stressed we are. I don't want to be stressed. I'm annoyed that these things are happening to me in my life. So I don't want to be stressed. I'm going to eat. And so if you can just start to establish that relationship with your own body by checking in and saying, like, what's going on right now? And in the beginning, it's so frustrating for people that I work with. They're like, I can tell I'm feeling something, but I don't know what it is. So I just want to tell you that's normal. So that'd be my third tip. It's a little thing you can do. Go ahead.
It's like, I love this because they're really simple. Be grateful, pat yourself on the back for little accomplishments, eat protein, which I'm all about as well as an athlete. And then finally pay attention because everybody is so different. And what works for your girlfriend Susie doesn't work for you. So always, yep, I love those three small strategies. And we definitely want to hear about how those strategies go for you guys. But before we close down, I want to ask Cassie how she helps women balance hormones and where we can find her.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, I have a 14-week program called the Stress Less Weight Mastery, where I help women balance their stress hormones, make peace with emotional eating, and really optimize their metabolisms to feel good and empowered in their bodies. And so, if you're interested in that, you can check out my balance hormones to curb after dinner overeating, my free guide at cassiechristopher.net/free. And that'll give you, similar to what we've talked about today, but even more practical boots on the ground, how to implement this whole protein, this daily routine that you need to balance your hormones at, again, cassiechristopher.net/free. I'd love to connect with you.
Great. Thank you so much for coming back, Cassie. And I always love chatting with you. We have so much in common and so much to share and so much passion that brings us together. It's always a pleasure. And then you, of course, are a wealth of knowledge.
Well, thank you for having me.
So listen, guys, we have this episode also in video. If you rather watch, be on the lookout for also the video where you can meet Cassie in person, almost. And of course, you can listen to the podcast. Please share it with anybody that you might know benefits from this episode because sharing is caring. And we'd love to hear from you. reach out to us on social media because Cassie is also on Instagram and on Facebook under her name. And mine is Heike Yates on all social media and Heike Yates Pursue Your Spark on Facebook. We want to literally hear from you, not crickets. We want you to tell us how this episode impacted you. If you have more questions, if you want to contribute something that we may have not thought about. So
Please.
please feel free to do that. And with that, I'm out of here and I'll see you next time on the Pursue Your Spark podcast. Ciao.